All right, speedrun. One game. 15 plus 10. And then we call it. Let's go. Mihail Angelo from Greece. Okay, 1e3, that's the Van Kruijs opening. You can play either e5 or d5. I like d5 just because if you play e5, white can play d4 and transpose to a tempo up French. So my preferred move is d5. Okay, so d3 is kind of like the hippo. And obviously here we should control the center with e5. My guess is that he's going to be playing the... Okay, no. Or is he going to push, like, all of his pawns up one square? Well, let's see. I mean, our approach here is just to develop pieces. Our approach is just to develop pieces and see what white does. How do we develop pieces? Well, there's multiple approaches to handling these kinds of troll openings. A lot of people get way too caught up in trying to figure out where the pieces belong. Really, anything is good. You can play c5 if you want, or you can play c6. You can play knight c6. I like starting with knight f6, just to preserve the possibility of pushing the c-pawn up to c5, h3. Now, in terms of the dark-squared bishop, where should we put it? What do you guys think? Should we put it on c5, d6, or e7? And in this case, there is one square which is better than the others in this case. Yeah, for sure, bishop d6. Better than bishop e7 because bishop d6 at least reinforces the pawn on e5. Yeah, generally the bishop belongs on d6. And you've often seen me play the move pawn c6 in conjunction with bishop d6. I really like that setup. But it's too early to decide what we're doing with the c-pawn because we still have... certain developing moves that we know we have to make, and one of them is, of course, to castle. So let's castle. Knight d2. And by the way, those disappointed that we're not having a mainstream opening, I really do think that a lot of people need practice playing against these kinds of offbeat openings. So it's not a waste of time. I think we can extract instructive value from this. And I'm glad that our opponent isn't doing something too trolly. Okay, knight d2. Once again, it's really a matter of taste how we want to handle this position. Some people like to have a bigger center and go c5. Totally fine. Some people, like me, I like to move c6 in such positions, just building up a nice little center. Or you could just play it conventionally with knight c6. Let's play... I really like to play c6 in these types of positions, just to reinforce the pawn. And in case white fianchettos the bishop, which is often going to be the case... Oh, and there we go. White's played e4, and aren't we happy that we played c6 in order to support the pawn on d5? Now we don't have to worry about e takes d5, and we can focus on developing the rest of our pieces. Now, I should point out that the way white is playing, it's not terrible. It's not like we're that much better. We have kind of like a reverse Philidor up maybe 2 or 3 tempi, so black is better, but you shouldn't expect to win the game in 5 moves against an opening, even against an opening like this, because our opponent hasn't done anything that much in violation of principles. He's developed his knight, he's controlled part of the center, and so we shouldn't go crazy here. So what should black do? How should black continue developing? A lot of people here would go bishop e6. That's not my preferred move. I feel like our bishop should remain on c8 for the time being. As I've said on several occasions, development isn't always a race. It isn't always about just bringing all of your pieces out automatically. Let's play knight bd7. And I think the common idea that we will apply in this position is to reroute this knight to what square? Reroute this knight to g6, kind of Ruy Lopez style. We're going to do that by playing rook e8, knight f8, knight g6. My coach would always say that a piece can be developed even sitting on its initial square. Now you might say, well, what does that mean? Well, what that means is, let's imagine a scenario, right, where white finishes developing in castles. That bishop on c8 could sacrifice itself on h3 without having made a single prior move. Now, would we say that the bishop on c8 was not developed? Well, not really. Developing a piece isn't always strictly necessary. And the bishop isn't doing much on e6 in comparison to c8. So we're leaving it on c8 for now. And we can play a5 here and expand a little bit on the queen side. I honestly don't see why not. a5 stops b4. So let's do some queenside expansion. We're not in a big hurry to play rook e8 and knight f8. And now we can play rook e8 and knight f8. Now that we've grabbed some space and prevented b4. Shouldn't we try to open up the center soon? Yeah, well, ideally we would, but unfortunately we can't. If we had a way to open up the center, we would. D takes c4 doesn't really open up the center. In fact, it helps white by opening up the diagonal for the bishop. So in this case, yeah, we should just keep the central tension, if that makes sense. All right, let's go rook e8, which is a good move in and of itself. It just gets the rook into the center. Knight e2. Okay. Now, we have two different pathways. We have two different possible pathways. We can go knight f8, knight g6 as previously planned. What's the other path that the knight could take in order to land on a similar square? Where else could we go with this knight, potentially? And we have we basically have two plans here. We can kind of play on the king side. We can, yeah, knight c5 is the other idea. And that hits white where it hurts. That d3 pawn is a major weakness, right? So can you propose a plan? And see, this is why we didn't develop the bishop on c8 until now. Can you propose a plan that involves getting our pieces onto squares such that we apply pressure on the d3 pawn? What little maneuver can we play? Yeah, I call this the hyper-fianchetto. We can play b6 and follow it up with bishop a6, an underrated maneuver. So that would be one option. Let's follow through on our initial plan, though, and let's keep b6, bishop a6 in mind as a potential follow-up possibility. But first, let's take care of this knight. Okay, knight g3. Perfect. That plays right into our hands. I was a little bit worried that our opponent would go g3, because then the knight on g6 would be a little bit lame. And in that case, we would have gone knight e6. Now, this knight can obviously jump all the way to f4, and so knight g6 makes perfect sense. If they go knight f5, then we play bishop takes f5 and force the pawn to recapture. That's not dangerous. What should we do now? Should we play b6, or do we have a better move? Yeah, definitely knight f4. Definitely knight f4. Because we now attack the pawn on g2. And if he castles kingside, then a sacrifice on h3 becomes a definite possibility. In addition, we could eliminate that bishop. Okay, bishop f3. Now, in playing bishop f3, immediately we realize that the pawn on d3 is left further weakened. So now that the pawn is only protected by the queen, it makes perfect sense to play b6 and bishop a6. We end up combining our two ideas, which is always fun. The hyper-fianchetto. We also could contemplate throwing in g6 at some point in order to fully limit the mobility of the knight on g3. Because remember, once you play bishop a6, we will no longer be protecting the f5 square, and so knight f5 will become a possibility. Nothing terrible about it. We can just drop our bishop back to f8. But something we could consider restricting even further. And, okay, knight f5 is played, and this is, to my eyes, a decisive mistake. And what we're about to do is going to be pretty instructive. So what should we do? What should we start with? Actually, let me think for a second. There. Yeah, we should take that knight. We should eliminate that knight. That forces the pawn from e4 to move to f5, where it's a serious weakness. And we have a very, very powerful follow-up to this move. Though partially, the reason that I'm taking on f5 consists in the follow-up. Now, anytime a pawn moves away from the center, you have to assess how that changes the dynamic of the center, what now becomes possible. In addition, you have to factor in the fact that the king is uncastled. A lot of you guys are correctly looking at the move e4. That move has to be calculated. So e4, pawn takes e4. Okay, pawn takes e4. And then white can try knight takes e4. And we have to find something against that move. And there is one, just give me a second. There's actually a lot of stuff to calculate there, and I will show you some of this after the game. But there's, believe it or not, e4 I think is not quite as clear-cut as it may seem to be. So takes, knight takes, bishop takes, and I know a lot of you are thinking that queen e7 in that position wins the bishop, but it doesn't. Can you tell me why not? After everything is captured on e4, takes, what happens after queen e7? Yeah, white has f3 defending the bishop. Now you might say, but doesn't f3 weaken the king? And it does, and we can give a check on h4 in that position. But the king drops to f1. I'm not entirely convinced that that's winning. I think black is doing great. Now, what do you do in such a scenario? Well, you need to take a couple of moments and see if you can't find anything better on the initial move. A lot of problems are solved by just thinking differently about the position. Now let me float an interesting idea to you guys. What if we forgot for a second about e4? What if there's a different approach? What if we can attack a different weakness? And I claim that if you think of it that way, you can play a move here, and maybe the computer will make e4 work. But there is a very simple move that causes unsolvable problems for white. What are white's other weaknesses? The pawn on f5 is itself a weakness, right? It's undefended. Yeah, a lot of you guys are thinking also about knight takes d3 and e4, another very interesting possibility. But I want to play it even simpler than that. Yeah, queen d7. Let's just go queen d7. I know it's very anticlimactic, but it's very effective. Because this pawn can barely be defended. And if white goes g4, with that incredible further weakening, I can guarantee you that e4 is going to be so much more effective. He castles, we pick up the pawn, and not only do we pick up that pawn, we are going to likely pick up another one on d3. That pawn simply cannot be defended. And that doesn't mean we're not going to play e4. We might play that in the future. Just because he's castled doesn't mean the king is going to be safe. Look at our bishop on d6. Once we play e4, that bishop is going to open up. You can start thinking about putting together batteries and mating ideas in conjunction with the knight. And this is the point that I've been making all speedrun long. That's actually the operating motivation behind this third speedrun, is this kind of simple chess is highly underrated, and you have to know how to play it in order to get to the next level and really develop the style that you want to play in. Is it possible to sack the knight on h3? Absolutely. That is a candidate move in some positions. But again, we might not need to do that. We might just be able to take on d3. Was queen c8 any better for queen a6? So I'll talk about that after the game, but unnecessary. What is the point of getting the queen to a6? It is to attack the d3 pawn, right? Well, you're doing that anyway from f5. It's just that you've also captured a pawn. And you're also aiming at the king side. So the point of the hyperfianchetto is no longer necessary. But yeah, e4 led to complications. And I'll be honest, initially I did think that we would play e4. But as I started to calculate, I realized that there were some complications. We'll check with an engine afterward. And I'll show you guys what it is what deterred me ultimately from playing e4. Okay, so now the first big think by our opponent. In the meantime, we can start pondering the question of what we want to take on d3 with. Both pieces are fine. But, okay, queen d1 answers that question for us. I like to talk about the queen as kind of the supporting actress. Sometimes getting the queen right into the thick of things is actually counterproductive. And you want the queen sort of back in the shadows, operating as more of the war general. So from that perspective, knight takes d3 is what appeals to me intuitively. Intuitively, I want to take on d3 with the knight. Yasser is the originator of that idea. But in this specific instance, queen takes d3 is also completely overwhelming because the queen is unassailable. It cannot be attacked. Bishop e2 is impossible. What is the queen doing on d3? Well, it's also attacking the pawn on c3. Now, this is a case of two incredibly good options. I really think it doesn't matter. I think both moves are completely overwhelming. Let's take with the queen. Let's violate the rule and take with the queen this time. The reason why is because I have a feeling that he's going to go bishop b2 and then we're going to win a piece. Or at least we're going to win more material. Yeah, very good, Agolian. e4 follow-up traps the bishop because the e2 square is protected by two of our pieces. And in response to bishop g4, we can do the classic h5, bishop f5, g6, and the bishop is going to be trapped. We're spoiled for choice. Important not to waste too much time in these situations. Knight b1 is the best move. See, this is why I wanted to take with a knight. Problem is this might force some sort of an endgame. And I'm not in an endgame mood right now. Okay, so because I'm not in an endgame mood, what can we do? Absolutely no need for knight takes h3, guys. G takes h3, and I don't see the attack. If we give a check on g6, remember, with this bishop on f3, white can drop that bishop back to g2, and that bishop acts as a very annoying defender. Queen g6, mistake. The move here is queen f5. Who can explain to me why? What is the difference between queen g6 and queen f5? Not a big mistake, but nonetheless a mistake. What does queen g6 allow? Think concretely. What does it allow? It allows white to take on f4. Why is that bad? It's not bad because it's a trade. Queen f5 also allows that move. It's bad because we have to take on f4 with the pawn. And if you think about it, that bishop on d6 is going to be not fulfilling its full potential. That pawn on f4 is going to be a very hard pawn to move out of the way. It's blockaded by the bishop. Does that make sense? So let's move the queen back to f5. In a classical game, I would contemplate the move e4 here because I normally would not mind an endgame up 2 pawns. We're completely winning in that endgame. For the purposes of this game, and of course now we take with the queen, we're going to try to keep queens on the board, and we're threatening the move e4 now. Probably g3 is going to be our opponent's choice. Definitely, I think I should have taken on d3 with a knight, but it's fine. Yeah, the move queen d2 here is a little annoying. That question is, so I'm getting a question about, like, what is a rule of thumb for trading queens versus keeping queens on the board? I mean, I've been talking about this for most of the speedrun, right? There is no algorithm. You just have to rule on a case-by-case basis. Okay, c4, allowing e4, now it's all over. Mate, and if g3, then we take the bishop, because the pawn will no longer defend that bishop. And in general, there's no algorithm for anything. Any kind of general decision, there are rules of thumb. There's stuff that can help you make the right decision, but everything in chess has to be done on a case-by-case basis at the end of the day. Okay, so he allows us to checkmate him. Nice. Nice game. And really the most interesting moment in this game was that moment when we could play e4. Van Kruijs opening e3. Yeah, e5, d4 is a little bit boring because a lot of the time you kind of end up taking on d4 and then it's a exchange French with colors reversed. It's totally equal. Probably knight c6 is the most principled move here, but then white can go knight f3. So ultimately this is a reversed French with a tempo down for black, nothing too impressive. I like d5. If you're a King's Indian player, by the way, the other way you can meet e3 is by playing knight f6 and g6. You can play a King's Indian setup against it. Basically, whatever opening you play against 1d4, you can play that setup against e3 and against b3 as well, by the way. Okay, so d5, thank you, Thirsty, for the 15 months, of course. So d3, e5, yeah, so c3. Here I thought he was going to troll us, but he ended up playing reasonably normal. Queen c2, knight d2. And e4, obviously, many tempi have been lost here with white. Okay, knight bd7. So everything here I explained. a5. How does this stop b4? The reason this stops b4 is because you take, then the rook is undefended. You have to notice this x-ray, and you just play bishop takes b4. So a5 is almost always a good move to throw in such positions. It restricts the mobility of the queenside pawns. Okay, rook e8, knight f8, knight g6. Yeah, so I think white should have played g3 here. I think white should have played g3 and fianchettoed. Here we would have gotten the knight to e6. G. Perez says, I don't get how g3 was bad for black tonight. Well, think of it this way. Robert loves to point this out. Anytime there are two squares between a pawn and the knight that are on the same file, it's generally going to be bad for the knight. Why is that? Because the pawn dominates the knight. The pawn controls both of the knight's advancing squares. The knight can really do nothing except retreat. Now, is retreating inherently bad? No, but the knight doesn't have anywhere appealing to retreat to. Now, this situation isn't always bad. Sometimes, in a different set of circumstances, you can simply sacrifice a knight on f4. I'm sure you guys have seen examples of that. You can go like this. But this obviously is premature in this case. This is only possible in situations where white's king is castled and you're ready to attack. Normally this situation is to be avoided and can result in mass restriction of your pieces. In general, just this idea of restricting pieces is very important. Identifying your opponent's pieces that are potentially active and then restricting them with your pawns. And by the way, I want to make 2 other points, and both of them I'm going to make through the lens of illustrative games. One of them by Wilhelm Steinitz, one of them by me. Since we're on this topic, I know we're going in a bit of a detour, but this is important, piece restriction. Let's have a look at a Steinitz game where he does something very, very similar, just to hammer in this concept. First game is this, English against Steinitz from 1883. English was a strong player. We join in this position. Black is obviously better. If you look at black's pieces, rook's on a good square, 2 bishops. And English plays the move knight b3. And in this position, Steinitz makes a very instructive sequence of moves. What do you think he plays? Take your time. What does black do in this position? And this is exactly on the theme of what we just discussed. Excellent. So Steinitz plays b6. First, he restricts the knight. H3, bishop b6, or kept. How does he follow up? And this next move is equally instructive. Very good. And you guys are already getting it even before we got to the moment. He plays c5. And if you look at how this pawn chain impacts white's pieces, it doesn't allow bishop d4. That's the point. And this knight is, look at how this knight is dominated. All of its squares are taken away by the pawns. And Steinitz ends up winning a very, very nice game. He just squeezes white off the board. He just keeps pushing his pawns. And keeps pushing. And then this idea, a5, a4. Getting that knight out of b3. This is going to dovetail onto the next game. Bishop c4. Complete domination. Trading off white's only active piece, i.e. the bishop. Leaving white with a lame knight. And then trading the rooks. And at the end, literally white is just left with this totally restricted knight. It's restricted by the bishop. Knight e2, and Steinitz has correctly calculated the pawn endgame is winning because the king shoulders white's king and then comes around and takes the pawn. How do you know you're not overextending? Well, what does it mean to overextend? Overextend means you have too many things to defend. And if you actually look at black's pawns, they're all defending each other. Black's pawns are all defending each other other than the a7 pawn, which is unattackable. So you're not overextending as long as you're making sure that everything is reasonably protected. And it's an endgame, right? It's harder to overextend yourself in an endgame. But now let's have a look at one of my games, really to hammer home this notion of using your pawns to restrict your opponent's pieces. Black to play. What did I come up with here? And the first move I think most of you should see almost immediately, but perhaps the follow-up idea will be less obvious. So again, we have a knight on g3. The knight wants to go to f5 and force me to give up one of my bishops. So we start with g6. You might say, well, how do I know that I can get away with this move? Isn't it weakening? Well, it is, but white's pieces are clearly too passive to really take advantage of that. But what did I do after white castled? What is the follow-up to g6? Bingo. h5. h5. Okay, he goes b4. h4, and forcing the knight all the way back, and he ended up just giving away this pawn. But this makes a tremendous impact on the coordination of white's pieces. So these ideas are important. Using your pawns to restrict pieces, using your pawns to chase pieces away. Okay, back to the game. Hopefully that made sense and helps you understand that a little bit more. So to summarize, after g3, it is better not to go to g6. It's probably better to go to c5 and resort to the second plan of attacking the d3 pawn. Okay, knight g3. This, of course, this is a bad move. This is a bad move because it gives us a direct pathway to f4. Knight g6. Yes, Steinitz English is the game I really think of as a symbol for restricting your opponent's pieces. Bishop e2, knight f4, and already white is in trouble. Bishop f3. Now this weakens the d3 pawn, and we play b6. Now, knight f5 is the decisive mistake, and white should have castled here. And how should white meet the move bishop a6? What should white do here? Isn't white losing? Not d4, that gives up the exchange. White has to play c4. And for extra credit, what should black do in this position? I think probably taking on c4 is... It's good to throw this in. But in this position, what should black do? And in order to figure that out, you again have to use the drawback principle. Okay, our plan has been successful. We have forced white to play c4. And what effect does that have on the position? Well, it weakens the d4 square. That is the main thing you should notice. Some of you are suggesting b5. I don't like this move. It doesn't really do anything. It doesn't create a threat. It looks good, but white can simply keep developing. Instead, I really like the idea of going bishop c5 and aiming for d4. The secondary idea that I like is knight back to e6 and then going to d4 with a knight. Very good, saved by God too. Deserve a sub for that. But I probably would go bishop c5 and then bishop d4 and look at how many squares we're controlling. The knight is good, the bishop is good, we've got an outpost, and we would potentially proceed to cement that bishop by playing c5. Now you might say, well, what about this bishop? Isn't this bishop bad now? Yeah, it is, and after we play c5, we can drop it back to b7 so that it pressures e4. Again, sometimes your pieces do a job on a square and then their services are required elsewhere. That's okay. You don't have to just rush to play b5 here and activate this bishop. It's done its job. Okay, so not every piece needs to distribute the COVID vaccine. Bishop takes f5, e takes f5. Now we get to the fun part. Why did I not play e4? So let's start with the simple line. dd4, d4, knight e4. Knight e4, bishop e4, queen e7, f3. In this position, I was simply not convinced that black is anything other. Black is full compensation. In fact, no, I think black is doing great. So queen h4 check. There's an idea I just spotted, which I didn't see during the game. Now, if queen f2, because of the pin, we have obviously a fork. If the king goes to the d file, then it goes from the frying pan into the fire, and this just looks unthinkable. There's a beautiful move after king f1. There is such a sexy move here. Not queen g3, but you're on the right track. Think about this square. What do you want to be on g3? What do you want to put on g3? Is it the queen? Really, Riley? Not rook takes c4. That doesn't do anything. White just recaptures. Knight h5. And white simply cannot stop this deadly move. Knight g3 is going to come with such massive effect. Even though white can technically defend against the fork. Oh, but now bishop c5 check, and it's simply mate. After king h2, the queen comes to g3. No, this is game over. This is simply game over. Knight comes to g3, and it's crushing. Okay, so I missed this. And this just shows you that you can't stop calculating. I kind of ended at this moment, and I said, it's not that clear. And I don't really blame myself for that. Knight h5 is not so easy to spot from a distance. How dare I miss this? That's right. So I guess this was good. Oh, but wait! No, I think I found an improvement for white. I think I found an improvement for white. Rather than playing f3, what else can white do here? I just spotted something in this position. No, not bishop e3. The bishop is hanging. The bishop is hanging on e4. Bishop takes f4. If bishop takes f4, then white plays f3, and there's no longer a knight. This is still very strong for black, but I think this is quite a bit more defensible. And if queen takes e4, which looks like it wins a piece, it's a fork, but again, bishop drops back to e3. So I guess I'm vindicated in the end. Yeah, there was this move. Now, the second thing we have to look at is queen e7 in this position. And this just shows you that you shouldn't automatically grab pieces. You have to consider, queen e7 instead of knight takes e4. But here I found a crazy idea. I thought that white could castle. Knight takes e4, and then rook e1, and I couldn't find a way for us to keep this extra knight. We'll check the engine move at the end. I just couldn't find a way to secure this knight on e4. And I thought white wins it back, and the position is quite unclear. So ultimately, this is the reason I didn't play e4. I thought it was too messy. Now, there was a really interesting possibility of taking on d3 first, and then playing e4. This, I think, is extremely strong, but also not as convincing as I would have liked it to be. What should white do in this position? Who can tell me? How should white deal with this? In fact, every move loses except this one. And that I can tell you for sure. Because if the queen moves away, then we take the bishop with the discovered check and white's position falls apart. So white has to give up a piece in the right way. Yeah, bishop takes e4 is correct. And the point is that after knight takes e4, white kind of escapes with a castle. And if we take with a pawn, I thought that white can drop the queen back, and white is holding on, although after even probably the move e3, black's attack is incredibly strong. Yeah, you could check with the knight, but then the king just drops to f1. Why take with the bishop and not with the knight, asks Vince Fleet. Because if you take with a knight, you take with a pawn, and you haven't dealt with the fork. You've just, thrown oil onto the fire. You still lose the bishop. Okay. So with that in mind, we decided on a much simpler approach, and we just end up taking all of his pawns. Now, if white had gone g3, then knight takes d3 is tremendously strong because the queen has this extra pressure on the f5 pawn. Okay, G.I. Perez is asking in this line, so I'm not sure where you're talking about, like where do you mean the knight? Some people were saying knight takes g2 check. That's a possibility, but the king just drops to f1. Yeah, so anyways, back to the game. Queen d7, castles, queen takes f5. Maybe white could have been more resilient, but ultimately the game is already over here. What about bishop g4? Well, bishop g4, we can just play h5 and pry that bishop away from that square. I don't think white has a defense here. I mean, maybe pawn g4 was the best, but now e4 is crushing. Because in addition to everything else, by playing queen d7, you have to sort of catalog the changes that happened. One of the things that happens is that the rooks become connected. Well, how does that help? Well, now we have a whole set of tactics that involve sacrificing one rook and bringing the other one to its aid. So rook takes e4 is the win, and then rook e8. So this one move really changes everything. And after castles, queen f5, okay, we win 2 pawns. The rest doesn't really require analysis. Again, white could have defended somewhat more resiliently, but this is just, this is just sad. Now let's check with the engine. My guess is that queen d7 might even be the best move. I mean, I don't know. We'll see. Yeah, it's saying that. Oh, it's saying that it actually likes knight c5 here. Interesting. Oh, knight g3 is best. Wow. I wouldn't necessarily trust that it's on depth 15, though. That's a very low depth. I would let it reach depth 25. But anyways, let's get to the moment we want to see. Queen d7 is good. You can see that it's basically keeps the evaluation. It was saying knight takes d3 is best. So e4 is not convincing. It goes all the way down to -2. So I was right. e4 is a mistake. And if queen e7, yeah, then white is better. Castles, knight e4. And now either bishop takes f4 first or rook e1 immediately. And black loses the advantage. So now d4 is not good here because white can just push the pawn. So knight d3, queen d3, e4. Bishop e4, de, queen e2. Yeah, and now e3 is very important. Sacking the pawn, opening up the e-file, and then slamming in knight d5. And white's position falls apart at the seams. So yeah, there are 2 approaches to this position, but queen d7, as you can see, keeps an overwhelming evaluation. Then queen takes f5. Yeah, queen g6 was best. Wow, so it wasn't even... First queen g6, and then knight takes d3. Okay, that's just computer stuff. Queen f5 is best. Actually, keeping the queens is the fastest. Yeah. So you can see, simple chess often produces the desired effect in a better way than convoluted chess. And we never needed to sack on h3 or even to think about that. Okay, that was a great game. Short, but I think there was a lot of instructive value in it. I hope you enjoyed. See you guys later.